We're live.
Yay.
Hello, welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. While I'm just checking my settings to make sure that our audio is set up correctly. Should be.
Yay.
Looks good. Welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I am Brandon Testers. This is Caitlin Miller. I don't know why I'm hosting. I introduced us both, I guess.
It's great. I like it.
Unfortunately, Marie Moran is not with us this week. We'll have her back soon. She'll be here every week generally, just not this week.
Yeah.
And next week is next week Memorial Day?
Yeah, I might be joining. I might not, but
okay.
Yeah. But I think Marie will be there.
We'll see who's going to be here next week, but someone will, unless someone's not. In which case, we'll send out messages as soon as we figure that out.
Mm-hmm.
This is not therapy for very, very many reasons. This is just an open conversation with Caitlin and I, both of us are licensed therapists, but this is not therapy. We do work at a therapy practice called Effective Artistry. Also provides executive functioning coaching services through our coaches, which are separate from our therapists. We are in the state of Illinois. We can only do therapy with people who are located in the state of Illinois. Although unfortunately, we are currently on a wait list.
Mm-hmm.
But hopefully I'm trying to
over the next
capacity.
month, maybe.
I
think something you skipped is that the coaches can do international.
Yeah, coaches can work with anyone, anywhere. It's all done online. Marie is one of our coaches. She's based out of the UK, out of Scotland, I believe specifically. So this is just an open conversation. This isn't therapy. It's just a conversation, and Caitlin and I are going to be talking with one another. And also, any of you who are here, if you would like, in fact, I would ask that you consider putting things into the chat, because it's always better to be more informed of what it is that you all are thinking. That can be questions, and it can be a bit of a question and answer format, but it doesn't have to be that. It's just a conversation. When people are in conversation, they are impacting one another, and the more information we have about you, the more we're impacted, and I think that's more interesting.
Yeah. Keeps me on my toes.
We usually pick a topic to start with. Did we do that today?
No, we didn't. It's the wild, wild west.
We did not pick a topic today. So today we'll just be talking. And whether we pick the topic or not, whatever you all put out there supersedes anything else. So we'll go wherever the conversation goes. It's the only way I know how to do it.
Yeah.
It's maybe a little convenient that I also believe that's the best way to do it.
Yeah.
And I think that's it, logistically speaking.
Yeah.
Cool. Welcome. What do you want to talk about?
So, I guess a thought I had about last week with the conversation about narcissism, I was talking to a friend and he watched it, and he watched the stream and he liked it a lot. It was very cute. But he mentioned, we were talking about it together, like a person in his life that he has labeled a narcissist, how he feels like it's more empowering to say, this person really harmed me, like to be more specific, to talk about the observable implications of this person's behavior versus calling them a narcissist, because he felt like that it's more like indisputable and it's also less of an excuse. So we were just kind of thinking about that. And I think that was my biggest takeaway from last week, is almost like the power of like naming nearly indisputable behaviors versus saying like, oh, they're a narcissist, and having that almost be like an excuse to continue to behave poorly.
Yeah, I think there is that, like, there's a trap either way, right? Like if you are talking about someone as a narcissist, you might use that as, it might be useful to you to say they aren't going to change. It's a part of who they are, and that can help you to change what you're doing in ways that are useful.
Yeah.
But it can also be seen as like well, they're a narcissist, I can't expect any better of them, and letting them off the hook a little bit. Mm-hmm. But either way, it's justification that isn't necessary. Mm-hmm. It's not necessary to explain why a person is doing the things that they're doing, except, like I said, in the only specific case I can see is where you're trying to decide whether or not you want to continue trying to work with this person in some way, in which case it might be useful to say, nope, it's inherent to who they are. There's nothing I can do about it.
But I feel like the flip side of that could be just to say, this person has repeated this behavior, and maybe like my attempts to have some sort of boundary or ask them to change their behavior consistently don't work. And so therefore,
I mean, ideally,
Yeah.
the bar for moving on from any relationship where enough harm is being caused that you're even thinking about this stuff, ideally
Yeah.
that bar would be very low. But
Mhm.
practically speaking, it isn't always for people.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's helpful. Everything is sometimes helpful. Sometimes it's helpful to say like, hey, you've put up with enough, right?
Mhm.
But sometimes that is also a harmful thing, or at least an unhelpful thing to say to someone, to say like, you should leave him. You know, that depends on the context. It can be useful. It's not a terrible thing to say that, but it also
Mhm.
can be a thing that just makes somebody feel bad and doesn't
Mhm.
do anything for them.
Yeah. Yeah, and that reminds me of, I think the sort of the concepts of like the cycle of abuse and victimhood and leaving relationships and when to leave it and when to label it certain things. And then there's like the socioeconomic factors sometimes and the societal, like, what's the word for it? Like women being taught to act a certain way and
When
yeah,
people are socialized a certain
yeah,
way.
socialized, yeah. So I don't know. I've thought about that a lot. I don't know what I would say about it, but it's an interesting conundrum that people get in. And one of the pieces of like advice I've heard that really bothers me, but I'm not quite sure how to say why it bothers me, is when people say, "Oh, she just needed to be in that relationship for 5 years until she realized he was abusive," instead of us telling her that he was abusive at like year 1. Like she just kind of needed to learn her lesson.
I hate that. Who does that?
I've heard it before.
That's
Yeah.
like a general thing that people will say, like they need to fail in order to learn,
Mhm.
which
So watch them fail.
well, like you can't always prevent it.
Yeah.
You can't always prevent someone from experiencing failure. And I'm not suggesting that you take on responsibility for making sure that no one ever fails or whatever.
Mhm.
On the flip side, if you can prevent it, it's hard to see much value in it's hard to see much value for that person in allowing them to fail. It can be valuable to you to have reason to say, I don't need to spend all the resources that I would, typically spend here.
Mhm.
Like basically it's a way to justify not helping that person.
Yeah.
Which is, you can think that it might sound selfish trying to justify not helping someone.
Mhm.
But if we look at the flip side, when there are people who take on all kinds of responsibility and push themselves to unreasonable limits to help people, it can be useful in those cases. All these things
Yeah.
are useful sometimes.
Yeah.
But yeah, if I don't see any reason not to try to help someone if all you're saying is the only downside is they won't learn if I help them.
Mhm.
Because that's nonsense.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean it's not true, which is why it sticks around.
Yeah, and I guess to connect that dilemma to being a therapist, I don't know if you've experienced this, Brandon, but I think there's a dilemma with therapists, like if they have a client who they believe is in an abusive relationship. I think there are questions about like, when do you mention it? When do you point it out? Do you name it as that? What is the psychological implication on the client if you name it abuse? What does that mean about your relationship with the client?
Like these are things that people try to discuss and determine in advance, like in general.
No, there was a supervision I was at once where like one of the therapists was saying, it's pretty clear to me that my client is in an abusive relationship, but I worry that if I tell them that it's abusive, then they'll feel pressure because of the power dynamic to leave the person, or if they don't, that I'm judging them, or that it's up to them to determine if it's abuse or not. Like, I don't know. And I know this all sounds silly, but I do think
it's not silly. It's valid. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, but I do think it's a dilemma that sometimes therapists have, is like,
well, therapists are not. Like, it's a dilemma that friends have. Do I tell them about how I think that their partner is being a jerk to them and that they should leave them?
Yeah.
And that's all understandable. I think the problem with some of these concepts, like abuse, for example, or this happens with trauma as well, narcissism. I mean, a lot of these things, is that some people will fall into the trap of thinking that the label A means specifically always what it means to them. They lose sight of the fact that just like any other word or concept, it means different things to different people. And that sometimes a difference of opinion on whether or not something qualifies as abuse is not just a difference of opinion about the thing that's happening, but a difference of opinion about what abuse is.
Yeah.
I think that is something that's worth remembering, because otherwise then people try to find these rules of like, when do I mention the word abuse? I mean, there's no different answer to that question than when do I mention any other word. When you think it might be helpful, you put it out there. And just like with anything else in the therapy situation, not necessarily relevant to like friends and stuff, although, maybe, is to say like, the situation you're describing to me sounds to me like it's abusive. And I don't know what that term means to you, but I know nothing about this except for what you're telling me. So I want you to be aware that to at least me, and if it's me, it's probably others as well, the way you're describing the relationship comes across, it strikes me in a way that I think, oh, that sounds abusive. I'm not saying that it is, and it's worth us discussing. But I think it's probably relevant to your life. Have other people responded to you as though this relationship that you're talking about is abusive?
Yeah.
I think that's where therapists sometimes lose some of their, it's just an opportunity cost. Passing up on the opportunity. When therapists define themselves as being fundamentally different from other human beings.
Oh, man.
And therefore don't treat their own reactions and thoughts as just as valuable and worth exploration as anybody else's. This idea that I must be right before I say a thing is nonsense.
Yeah.
These aren't things you can be right about, for one.
Yeah. Yeah, and I feel like withholding observations is part of like inauthenticity. I don't know.
Well, it certainly is like where this all gets tricky. I mean, where everything we're talking about gets tricky.
Oh, we had comments.
Shoot.
I can't read them. I'm blind.
In job interviews, I often hear people talking about how they're looking for someone who's a self-starter. When I ask about their mentoring approach, they say some version of, we throw them in the deep end so they can experience the work and learn.
Ooh.
So you don't mentor people, got it. Yeah. It's other ways people phrase things to make it sound like they're ready and willing to help, but they're really not. Yeah, we've been talking a lot about, like over the past few weeks, about how people have co-opted, about how people use neurodiversity language to really just talk about the medical model. And that's an inevitable thing, right? Like if some language is new, it's introduced because it is helpful in some way that previous language was not. Some people will use it in the new way. Some people will adopt the new language without fundamentally changing what it is that they're talking about or how they're talking about it, just the language. And this is one of those. Yeah, like, I mean, in this particular case, yeah, it's a lot to expect of anyone when they're asked, how do you mentor people, to just say, we don't, like, so I mean, obviously this is just a hypothetical and whatever, but it's not necessarily that that's their way of saying this is our mentoring style. That might just be their soft way of saying we don't mentor people, like we expect you to figure it out, which is ridiculous. It's a ridiculous expectation. But not everybody has that idea. I mean, this is what we were just talking about. You got to let them fail. A lot of people believe that, especially in our culture, that, like, to me, it's much more relevant in parenting circles.
I was thinking that too, yeah.
Parents all the time say, I can't protect my child from every failure. They got to learn how to deal with failure, and etc. And what I try to tell people is they will fail beyond your capability to anticipate it or prevent it. You do not have to. It's not like if you choose to never let them fail, then they will therefore never fail. So all you're talking about is, in an instance in which I think I might be able to prevent a coming failure, do I think it's a beneficial thing to do that or not? And that's a useful conversation to have, but not because it's beneficial to them to not help them.
And I guess I feel like, and I can't read the comment because I'm blind, but related to the comment, when I've been in that position and people have said something like, we knew you were kind of headed for failure, but you needed to just experience it to learn it. Like that's you needed to have, like, you needed to burn your hand on the stove for you to realize the stove is too hot.
Sometimes when people say that, they mean Sorry, were you saying more? I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah, I wasn't.
Sometimes when people say that, they're meaning like, I tried to warn you, but you weren't listening.
Mm-hmm.
And so you had to experience, like sometimes they're describing why their attempts to help didn't work.
Yeah.
Sometimes they are saying, no, I didn't even try to tell you because I didn't think it was worth trying to tell you. Because
That's the one that I really don't like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And even in the case of like, I tried to warn you, but you needed to experience it. Well, there are a lot of other reasons that a person might not receive or heed or respond in a particular way to a warning than just they don't believe it's necessary.
Mm-hmm.
That's one reason, but there are others.
That reminds me of, there's more comments.
That's my dad. He says that the stream is glitchy on Twitch, but he couldn't find us on Facebook. I don't know why that's happening, but I'll look into it after the stream. Yeah, Coach Fritz is my dad. He shows up quite a bit. He's awesome.
Can I mention your manuscript briefly?
Sure,
okay.
Everything's awesome.
So something that reminds me, I was reading the second half of your intro yesterday about describing.
I'm working on a book. That's what Caitlin's.
Oh yes, yeah. There's a yeah. It reminds me of your example of don't get too close to the edge of a cliff because it's dangerous versus like giving someone the 20 reasons why getting close to a cliff will potentially kill them and like describing all of those things. And it kind of reminds me of what we're talking about in failing at work, like the difference between, I don't know, clearly communicating to someone a concept versus just saying like, don't do this. And then saying to them, oh, they just didn't listen to me. And I think the thing I got from the introduction was that it can be much more costly to explain all of those things, but that it can also be much more effective because the person like deeply understands the concept of why I shouldn't get close to the edge of a cliff instead of just doing it because they're trying to please you or that Does that make sense?
So just to give some context, and it might help us to talk about it in more detail too. Mm-hmm. The book that I am working on is around the accomplishment equation, which I've talked about on the stream and podcasts and things. Talking about cost and value and et cetera. And the specific thing that the part that you're referring to is where I'm saying there are two ways to get information for humans. One is through direct observation of the environment, like through our physical senses experiencing a thing. The other is to get information from other humans that is communicated to us by them. And in that second case, there are two different ways to communicate information about like what should be done or what might be helpful or or harmful or whatever. There's lots of other things, but when we're talking about advice or like this was good to know or that's a bad thing to do or whatever, there's two ways to do that. One is to say we just kind of interpose ourselves as a representation of the problem. We say don't do that, it's forbidden, which means if you do that thing, I think it's bad and I might think less of you. Mm-hmm. And it might not even be a threat in that sense. It might be just saying, hey, you trust me and I know some of my stuff. Just trust me. This is not a thing that you want to mess with. Mm-hmm. The other way is to say, we don't do that, or I don't think you should do that because if you do X, Y, and Z. And the specific example I use is playing by a cliff. That the human communication advantage is that you can learn that a cliff is dangerous without having to play by the cliff and fall off it and get hurt. Other humans can communicate it to you, but they can say, don't play by the cliff. That's a rule. If you go over there, I'm going to get mad at you or I'm going to ground you or whatever. Or if you stay away from it, I will be happy and I'll respect you and I'll think of you as, a good person or whatever. Yeah. And that might work. But if it does, it relies on that either I trust you, that you don't have to explain yourself. I just believe that there's good reasons because I trust you. And if in the future my trust of you changes for any reason, which I think is worth talking about maybe, then the effectiveness of that lesson will change too. Mm-hmm. Or I have reason to desire you feeling good about me or fear you feeling bad about me. Mm-hmm. And if those things are not true, and what I was trying to point out is in that case, it doesn't actually matter whether I do the thing or not. Mm-hmm. It matters whether you think I did it. Mm-hmm. If I don't play by the cliff, but you think I did, you're still going to punish me. Mm-hmm. So I'm more focused on managing your belief. And
to me, that sounds like most classic parenting, right?
I mean, that's most human communication because it's far more cost effective. Mm-hmm. we can't explain every single thing in perfect
Mhm.
detail.
Yeah.
So the vast majority of our communication is done in that simple way.
Mhm.
And then the other way is to say, don't play by the cliff because, how it hurts when you fall. Like, if you fall off that cliff, it's going to be much, much bigger and it will hurt you and might even die. And even if you think that you're safely far back enough from the cliff, sometimes there's a gust of wind, or sometimes, that cliff exists only because the soil over there is eroding, and sometimes some of it's just loose and it falls. So you might fall off even if you think you're safe.
Mhm.
And at that point, it doesn't matter whether you trust me. I mean, except to believe that
To
what
a
I am
certain
saying
extent,
is
yeah.
useful. But you have my reasoning now.
Mhm.
And you can investigate that reasoning. You can ask other people, or you can do your own experimentation or learning to investigate that reasoning. And it doesn't matter whether I think you've played by the cliff or not played by the cliff, or it doesn't matter, because that's not why you would be doing it differently.
Mhm.
And that's much more costly,
Mhm.
but it persists regardless of those other things. And importantly, it enables you to then explain it to other people
Mhm.
instead of, because a lot of the time that stuff we were talking about, found on Facebook. I'm good, glad. My dad's watching us on Facebook, and the stream is better over there for him.
It makes me so happy your dad is watching this.
Yeah, my dad's awesome.
It's so cool.
My dad and I used to, when we were on long road trips, my mom and brother would sleep in the back, and we'd sit and talk about this stuff, philosophy and the human experience and what it means to be conscious. I remember doing that as young as like 8, 9, 10, 11, stuff like that.
That's so sweet.
But yeah, sometimes people aren't explaining in more depth because they don't have more depth.
Mm-hmm.
Because they were told the simple version and they've lived by it and it works. So when they tell you to do it that way,
mm-hmm.
and you say why, they say because that's how it works.
Well, and I was going to ask you, why do you, and I truly don't know the answer to this question, but why do you think when I was reading that, I was so much more like attracted to the second answer?
Well, neurodivergent people generally are going to be more attracted to the second answer.
Yeah.
The less you understand something, the less intuitive sense something makes to you, the less
mm-hmm.
something has been useful in your own life, the more you're going to want to understand the reasoning behind it.
Yeah.
Because it's very difficult when you get told your whole life to just make a list, but that doesn't work for you. It's very difficult to keep telling people. It's difficult even to think of yourself in any way other than, well, that's how it works. That's how everyone does it. I can't do it that way, so there's something wrong with me.
Yeah, and I think people in the past have been annoyed sometimes by my questions that would be similar to the cliff example, like, tell me why it's dangerous. Tell me what about the gusts of wind. Tell me about the height. Tell me about the structure of the earth that makes it more likely to fall apart. Tell me about the branches down, like all those things, like, and people are just kind of like, well, you're just not supposed to play by the edge of a cliff. Like, why are you asking me these questions? I'm just like, please tell me.
Well, but that's what I'm saying. They don't always know.
Yeah.
They were
that's
told
a great
not to
point.
play by the cliff.
Yeah.
They didn't.
Mm-hmm.
It worked out for them. They're trying to tell you the same thing. And you're asking them why, and they don't know why because they never asked.
But it seems like culturally people don't want to admit that. Like, I'm not sure why you're not supposed to play near a cliff. That's actually a good question. Maybe we should explore that together. Like,
I mean, how do you feel when I ask you a question that you don't know the answer to?
I actually like it. I believe I like it. I don't know.
Too. I think it is valuable. And I do at this point actually, for the most part, enjoy it when someone asks me a question I don't know the answer to. I like exploring things. And sometimes the way in which I explore things, it just happens so quickly and it sounds like I'm giving an answer that I've explored in the past when really I'm just kind of exploring it in that moment.
Yeah.
Because really, once you move past this cultural thing that revealing any lack of knowledge is a weakness, which is a cultural thing. There are reasons. It's not only cultural. There's reasons our culture believes that, because it is vulnerability. Revealing any lack of anything is giving someone else information that could theoretically be used to be harmful to you in some way, right? Mm-hmm. But if you can move past it, and I'm not saying you should move past it all the time in all contexts, but in the relationships or the context in which you're able to move past it, then you just get to jump straight into the exploration. Mm-hmm. And that is so rare that when I jump into the exploration, sometimes people think that I've already thought of it because I didn't say anything about hesitating or whatever, you know. Mm-hmm. But it's so much more fun.
Yeah.
That's what I've said a lot. One of my more favorite controversial statements of mine is that psychology is the antithesis of therapy. Psychology is harmful to the process of therapy. I think of therapy as applied philosophy, not applied psychology. Psychology is a field which attempts to answer the question, why do people do what they do? Through empirical observation and research, which is a valuable thing to do. But it's an unanswerable question in any specific instance. We can look at trends, as a species or as cultures or groups or communities or whatever, and that's useful. But when I'm talking to one person, if I think, oh, I know why you're doing what you're doing, you're a narcissist, it actually means that I'm not listening to you because I already have my idea of why you're doing what you're doing. Whereas philosophy is all about, we're exploring questions that really can't theoretically be answered or might not be able to be theoretically answered because there's utility in exploring those questions. Even if it's frustrating sometimes to not be able to say this is definitely what happened or what is happening, it's still useful sometimes. Our job is, as therapists, to ask those kinds of questions, get people to think about things in different ways, not to give them new answers.
Yeah, and something I'll notice with clients is the more I lean into that, sometimes there's like this liminal space of going from you're just supposed to tell me an answer to there kind of are no answers, so let's just talk about that and explore together. I feel like the liminal space is usually like, okay, I can acknowledge, Caitlin, that what you're saying is probably right, but not having an answer makes me feel so like almost like destabilized or like the does that make sense? Like the process of going from there are these like concrete answers to everything to so many things are vague and it just is so context dependent and there isn't causality and
honestly a lot of the way that psychology is applied in individual people's lives, whether it's to themselves or in therapy or other people, whatever, it reveals that in many cases we would rather believe that we know why something we hate is happening, even if the reason that it's happening is because I am bad and broken and there's nothing I can do about it. I would rather sometimes think that I keep making my life crap, even though I don't want it, than to say, no, I am not doing that, or at least I'm not trying to, but I don't understand why it's happening. There are many cases in which people would rather have an answer, even if it is logically flawed, even if it is unhelpful, even if it's harmful. There are times when it's preferable to feel as though I understand it, even though the thing I think I understand is actually terrible, than to say, I don't know. Because unknown is unknown. Like a specific version of this in our culture, call it, self-starter, right?
Oh no.
We are, the messaging and the incentive that is given to us in our culture is to believe as though we are in total control of everything that happens to us. And so when something terrible happens that I don't want, I'm still incentivized to find some way to say, no, actually, I did want that, even though I didn't want it.
Yeah, it's funny. I was just listening to a podcast on free will earlier today, and they were talking about that sort of thing.
Really?
Yeah, but continue.
No, I'm curious.
No, it was, there was, should I go into the example?
Whatever
I don't know.
you
can stop me at any point, but there was like a thought experiment about, you're on an airplane and a person is coming by with a drink cart and you have the option of having water, soda, or orange juice. Was it free will that you immediately had for example, a memory of having a stomachache after having orange juice as a child, and so therefore you chose the soda? So does that make sense?
It does. To me, the debate over free will, which is interesting and honestly, especially without Marie here, you and I are more prone to getting into the weeds.
Oh, I can try to get us out of the weeds.
No, I don't think we're in the weeds yet, but
Yeah.
I'm just trying not to take us there.
Yeah.
Because otherwise I would. Anyway, The debate over free will, like many things, is really a debate over what we mean by the term, but everybody's talking about it like it's a debate over whether or not it exists. Like, do we have free will? Well, free will is a construct. It's a concept. It's not an observable empirical thing. It's an idea. It's a term that we have invented to encapsulate a certain experience. So, to me, debating whether or not free will exists is kind of like debating whether or not a fire exists, when really we're just talking about what we use the word fire to mean. The thing that exists. How we talk about it, how we conceptualize it is worth exploring, but it doesn't change. I'm trying to stay out of like jargony words. Each of us have a subjective experience internally of feeling as though we have made a choice. There are times where we can say, I chose that deliberately, and times where we can say, I did not. That exists. Whether we call it free will or what exactly the mechanisms of it are, is fun to explore and potentially at least valuable to explore, but not in terms of being able to deduce whether or not it exists. It does.
Well, and I guess the thing I was connecting it to is if you take someone who says, I don't know, I slept in until noon for most of my adult life because I am broken and I'm depressed, and that's the story I'm telling myself, that I think I'm kind of losing it now, but like questions of where's the intersection of free will and being broken, and telling this story of like, I could have forced myself to wake up earlier all of these days. Like I could have done. Does that make sense? Like almost like the regret.
But the problem with that is the same as the problem with people talking about capability as though it is static and binary.
Yeah. A
hypothetical statement of I could have blank. You live one time. That moment occurred once. What do we mean you could have? You mean in other similar situations there are times in which I am able to behave differently? Sure. But otherwise, what are we talking about? Who knows whether you could have or not?
Yeah.
You didn't. That's kind of what I'm talking about with the narcissism thing too. We get very, very focused on these abstract concepts of why do things happen, which is an unanswerable question. Cannot be
I think
answered.
a lot of people would be upset with that idea.
Everyone would be upset with that idea, which is why we're all pretending like it can be answered.
Yeah.
Because take literally
it's really
any
destabilizing.
Let's even say, okay, this person slept in until noon most of their adult life because they're depressed. Let's say that that's an accurate statement. We can also make another accurate statement and say, well, they slept until noon their entire adult life because they were able to without, consequences.
Oh yeah, there could be like 100 reasons.
Right. So that's what I mean when I say it's unanswerable. There is no. These are stories we're telling ourselves.
Yeah.
And they're useful only insofar as they help us determine what to do next, or to shift the way that we feel about something. But it is not something which can be independently verified as being the true singular answer, which is a lot of what psychology is used for, even though psychologists, I think, would generally, like most scientists, would say that it's much more nuanced than that, and that there are no clear answers. That's not how it's utilized.
Yeah, because isn't there the phrase like correlation, not causation, or whatever?
Yes, correlation does not equal causation.
Yeah.
The thing about that is that usually, at least in my experience, when people are using that phrase or hearing that phrase, generally what they interpret it to mean is just because a thing is correlated doesn't mean that one caused the other. But it leaves open this idea that there are some things which are correlated in which one did cause the other.
Okay.
And when it comes to behavior, that's not true. There are other fields of study where we can say, with I don't know enough about like physics, for example, I would assume
it's super cool.
So physics is super cool.
So cool.
I know a lot about it, but I'm not a physicist,
Yeah.
I'm just saying, for me, I would say that in physics, we could probably say with reasonable confidence that X causes Y. A physicist might say, no, we know for sure, like it is demonstrably so, that X causes Y. And I don't know enough to know the distinction there.
We also have another comment that I cannot read.
It's astounding how many debates can be boiled down to lexicography. Pretty much all of them.
Yeah.
I mean,
totally.
All of them involving constructs anyway.
Yeah.
Because you use the phrase, you didn't use undebatable, you said indisputable.
Yeah.
And then you shifted, we said it again, and you said nigh indisputable, because to dispute is to just for one person to assert that something different is true, that I'm disputing. And I could say that that's not the sun. I could say, like a person can dispute anything.
Yeah.
Because it's all language.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
and for some reason, I always think of religion when we talk about like indisputable truths. Like, I don't know. I don't want to say too controversial things.
Why not? I mean, you don't have to if you don't want to, but.
Well, because so I try to think of like the systems in society that are the most, benefit the most from having absolute truth. And I feel like government does, moral systems do, I think religion does, I think some of the school system, like, sort of like, the criminal justice system.
The larger scale, the more you need to rely on simplified understanding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
if
that's a good point, yeah.
To me, totally like, whatever, being philosophical. Pull us out of the weeds, viewers. I don't know, whatever. To me, surprise, surprise, I've thought through this a lot and come to my own conclusions. To me, truth, the idea that something, there's two elements to it. Mm-hmm. One is accuracy. Mm-hmm. The other is totality. Mm-hmm. And so the reason that nothing that we say, with one notable exception, to me, that nothing we say or think can be true is because even when it's accurate, it's incomplete. Mm-hmm. We are incapable of having a full understanding or awareness of how every atom in the universe is positioned, and et cetera. Mm-hmm. And that's, that doesn't mean that we can't draw reasonable, actionable conclusions about what is true. Mm-hmm. But if we're talking philosophically, that's what correlation doesn't equal causation really means. Is there in science, in the scientific method, when we're running experiments, we have to do controls, right? We have to find the parameters that we believe affect the outcome or will affect the outcome of the experiment, and control for those parameters so that we can reliably say that the dependent variable shifted only in response to the independent variable. But theoretically, philosophically, we can't say that a particular moment in time doesn't have variables unique to that moment in time, which we cannot observe, but which are impactful. Yeah. That the particular arrangement of molecules, the Earth is hurtling through the universe, both around the sun, but also the entire solar system is moving out from the center of the universe, and the galaxy is spinning. We are at any moment, we cannot ever be in the same place relative to the position of the universe or whatever. Yeah. So philosophically speaking, that's what we mean when we say correlation does not equal causation, is you can never say X caused Y. Mm-hmm. And in therapy, I do think that's relevant. My example of, it is. If I slap this and it falls out of my hand, and I can say, why did that fall out of my hand? Mm-hmm. The logical and most useful thing to say is because you smacked it, which, yes, that's true. But we could also say that if I had smacked it, but we were in a zero gravity environment, it wouldn't have fallen out of my hand. Mm-hmm. Or if I had smacked it, but it was shaped differently, or I was holding it differently. There are other variables which must also be true for X to have caused Y. And so we can't isolate it. So to me, truth, there's only one truth, which is I can tell the truth about my internal experience. Mm-hmm. Because my internal experience is gated through my language, which means that the language that I use externally can both completely accurately and in totality encapsulate my internal experience. There is nothing else to it beyond my ability to label it.
Mm-hmm. Is another way to say that, like, if we only have so much like limited attentional capabilities, that the things that we observe with the attention we are distributing towards our environment is inherently truthful because it's what we're experiencing. Does that make sense?
No, and I might not be parsing your question correctly, but
I'm trying to be a weed whacker right now. That's getting out of the weeds. It's a joke.
Oh,
yeah.
I did not put that together. No, when it comes to observation of the external world, we're talking about accuracy and utility, not truthfulness, because that's a binary. It's true or it's not true.
Yeah, so you can say that certain statements are accurate because it is what the person is experiencing.
Accuracy and truth to me are two different things. So like we can accurately call a fire, and to call it an elephant would be inaccurate. Neither, whether we call it a fire or an elephant, neither of those things changes what it is.
Yeah.
Neither of those things determines exactly what will happen next. So accuracy means contains enough detail and connects to enough other information or experiences or detail in order to be useful in some way. Inaccurate is it's not useful. Like, can we really say it's not an elephant? I mean, could we really say it's not fuego or whatever? Like different sounds that we make, it's only because we've made a connection, we've decided that there is a meaning here. And that connection is useful or it's not. If it's useful, it must be accurate. If it's accurate, that doesn't always mean it's useful. It just means that there's an interpersonal agreement that we are using language in a way which accurately reflects the thing we're discussing. And this is what I'm talking about, getting into the weeds. To me, this matters, but this is like, some of this is like, you don't need to talk to your mechanic about the specific, like you don't need everything explained unless it's relevant and you're asking questions. And if people were asking questions, well, you are, and that's why we're having fun talking about it. But otherwise, I worry that it's, because
that is what, to be honest, that's one of the things that I'm hoping to add to the stream is someone to kind of be like a weed organizer or a weed whacker or like a guide to get out of the weeds.
I mean, I think Marie does that. And she
totally.
does that well. I think I'm glad to have you here because we can convert, not that Marie can't, but it's useful to have somebody who's keeping, part of the reason I'm struggling more today is because we don't have someone keeping an eye on what is relevant to the viewers and et cetera. So I'm trying to keep some of that. And it inhibits my ability to fully engage in the conversation with you because I'm trying to keep an eye on that because I don't trust that someone else will do it right now.
And I literally can't read them, so.
But just like things like realizing that when you say manuscript, they don't know what we're talking about, for example, like stuff like that, where it's useful to have, and even the fact that Marie, to us, is on the same, located on the TV screen over there. So when we're looking at Marie, it's like we're looking at the audience, where you and I can then just fully engage with each other. But
it reminds me of like actors. What do they say? Like pan to the audience. Like you're supposed to pretend you're talking to the other actor, but you're actually like looking into the crowd.
Cheating out.
There we go, cheating out.
Which we are doing. Notice that our chairs are not facing each other. Our chairs are both facing. It's like a talk show, between two ferns or whatever.
That's so funny.
Because we're having a conversation, but it is intended for the observation of an audience. It's a performative conversation. So we're trying to do both.
Well, would getting out of the weeds be going back to the first comment at all? Or do you have any ideas?
I don't even know. Well, okay. There was a thing I wanted to say, which is, this is why I push back so hard against the idea of like right and wrong or correct or incorrect when it comes to the stuff that we're talking about.
Yeah.
There are right and wrong, just like need and whatever. These are things, success and failure. These are things which are valid and real things, but exist only within parameters, within constraints. And by talking about them without talking about the parameters or the constraints, they lose their utility. So it's not about correct or incorrect. It's about what's useful. And you were mentioning truth and absolute truth and whatever. And we talked about scale. The thing about those two different types of communication, right? And of course, there are infinite gradations in between. It's not a binary this or that type. It's just examples that closer to the end that's relatable, right? is that it's not always useful to have more detail.
Yeah.
And that cognitive miser theory to me is so important, that we are limited. There's nothing anyone can do about that. Nobody likes to acknowledge it, because that means that there are things beyond our control, beyond our ability to even observe, much less understand or manipulate in some goal-oriented way. But we are limited, and our systems, let's say our brain, to simplify, is at all times trying to manage our limited resources in the most useful way. We're trying to pay as much attention to a thing as is useful without paying more attention than is useful, because if we're paying more attention than necessary, well, that extra attention could have gone to something else that would have had value for us, and we've wasted it. So we're aiming for exactly enough, not too much, not too little, and that's impossible.
Ugh.
I mean, because those are relative terms, you can't know, but we adjust, or at least we're capable of adjusting in some broad way. So it's what cost is worth what value. And when you're operating on a large scale, there's value to that. There are things that we as a species, as a culture, have accomplished, which could not be accomplished without the coordinated effort of just unimaginably massive amounts of people in unimaginably specific ways, and that no individual person is going to be the person who sees the whole picture. Everyone's just doing their part of it and is aware of some of the other parts of it nearby them, etc.
Yeah.
And we can't coordinate on a massive scale without some way. In my philosophical ramblings to you last week, I was talking about how language must be an imperfect container. The more broadly accessible language is, the less perfect of a container it must be. I can use very specific language when it's you and I, because we have developed that language. I have specific information about you.
Yeah.
But if I'm trying to phrase something in a way that millions of people will be able to understand, it's impossible. But the closest I can get to it is by making it as simple and as broad as possible. And especially if I am able to control the premises, set the premises that we all share. Let's all just accept that blank. And as soon as we do that, it makes a lot of other conversations easier.
There's another comment.
I exist to derail the conversation. Unfortunately, I'm distracted trying to find this one anecdote about a philosopher's camp, a linguist, and something about a tree. Well, now
I love this role. It's like, what is it called? Breaking the fourth wall or something?
Breaking the fourth wall is acknowledging that what you're doing is fictional.
Yeah.
So what?
It kind of feels like that, even though it technically isn't that. I don't know.
Well, we're just talking with people that this is right now a conversation between 4 people. 2 people in the comments and 2 people here. And because 2 of you are in the comments, your role in the conversation is different. Our access to information about you and what you're saying is different, but it's a conversation.
It would be kind of cool if people could show up like their faces and just like enter the conversation.
There are ways to theoretically do that, and I actually have in the past expressed some desire to be able, like, that if someone asks a question that we would be able to say, like, would you be interested and willing in coming on camera and discussing it with us or whatever?
Because it would be nice to sometimes have follow-ups about, like, maybe we start to answer the question and then the person says, actually, there's this other piece of information that helps.
That happens sometimes. Like when someone's asking a specific question, then I sometimes, well, I mean, like we were just talking about, general versus specific. These are 2 ends of a spectrum. The more you are of one, the less you are of the other. And they both have utility. Being general means talking about things in such a way that encapsulates as many of those things as possible. But that also means it leaves out as much detail as possible. If I'm trying to identify a day and I just say it was a day, that's a general thing because it is applicable to all days. It does not help us narrow down to be more specific. If I say it was yesterday, that's a specific day we can identify, but now whatever I'm saying is no longer applicable to all days. So right now what we're talking about is super general. We are not talking about any specific thing. We're talking about things that are applicable to the universality of like the human experience. So it's all super vague. But when people ask specific questions, then we need specific information. And that's the scale thing,
Yeah.
Like
Which I think is something you were trying to grapple in the introduction of your book.
It's something I'm grappling with, and even the concept of writing a book.
Yeah.
Because
But you have to do it, Brandon. I'm just kidding.
The purpose of it is to be accessible on a large scale to people that I am not directly interacting with. At least in the stream, even if there were theoretically thousands of people watching it, which I'm sure there are. No.
Yeah, of course.
But they have the option to clarify and ask a question. If I write a book and someone's reading it and they interpret it differently than I intended and it causes harm, I'm not even going to be aware of that, much less have any ability to, intercede.
I like it when authors do like live Q&As and stuff like that after publishing stuff. I think that's
I'm never
one way
going to stop this. This will
always
be. I like talking better than writing, but same thing. There's value in that. It's accessible to people in different ways and at different times than this is, and different types of people, etc.
There's something else.
I firmly believe this VOD will go viral. Neither Caitlin nor I are prepared for that, but
yeah, if we say narcissism enough, we'll get more YouTube views.
I do sometimes for myself, like just as a fun thing, I come up with things that I'm like, oh, that would be very popular or whatever.
There's a way to like analyze search trends on Google and then choose the buzzwords and all that gross
I've heard,
stuff.
but I don't care to do that.
I know you don't.
Not because I don't want this to be accessible or for people to be aware that it exists. I just don't care to spend the cost.
Yeah, I think it's really cool to do live. There's another comment now.
Speaking of derailing and publishing, but Rothfuss is publishing a short story and another novella, which great. I'm glad. This Bast Insider has been here many times, and we have in the past discussed the author Patrick Rothfuss. Actually, I just realized it's a novella about the character Bast. I never put together. When I saw Bast Insider, I was assuming the Egyptian deity Bast. But is the Bast in your name a reference to the Bast from the Kingkiller trilogy? Anyway, I want that third book, Rothfuss.
I think they said it's both.
Yes. Sorry. The microphone is covering the names of your cats. Well, Bast is the Egyptian deity that was represented by a cat, right? I think. That's why I always assumed that that's what it was.
One of my friends would definitely know the answer to that question because she loves Egypt and she has 4 cats.
Speaking of religion and mythology, like this is all the same thing. It's us doing what we are able to do as humans, which is to use language, our ability to abstract things and symbolically represent things to try to understand or represent or model reality in a way that is useful to us. Doesn't matter whether it's true or not.
Oh, we have 2 minutes.
Oh, thank you for telling me.
I don't have a 2 p.m., but...
I don't either, but we should move on. After Bast is son of remnant from the books, but I knew going in that it's also the Egyptian cat god. Cool.
I love these facts. That's cool.
And the god of Wakanda. I forgot about that. Yeah. That one is very clearly a reference to or lifted from Egyptian mythology, but in Wakanda, it's a panther god, not a cat god. So you got to get all the nerd information.
I know. I really have to catch up. I'm going to rely on you for that because I don't know if I'll ever catch up.
I have a lot of thoughts on like fandom and all this stuff. It's about scale and language development. Developing language to the extent that it is useful and no further. And when we encounter a place in which our existing language is limited, we develop new language in order to further the utility, increase our capacity to do something. But then language, this kind of language, I use that word to mean a different thing as well, but shared language is something which spreads, and it spreads beyond its initial creators. It's like jargon, for example. Jargon is always developed because, or theoretically at least, because it encapsulates some very complex but very specific thing, which is only useful in very niche circumstances, and therefore only a very few people have any reason to know or use that language. But then it spreads beyond that, and all of a sudden it becomes, I like this term, a shibboleth, a thing to say to demonstrate belonging. Shibboleth is a biblical reference or Torah reference, depending on your background. But,
Mhm.
you know, kind of like a code phrase that if you say it that way, people know you belong to a
Interesting.
certain group or
I
whatever.
was thinking of, I don't know how to pronounce this, but Schadenfreude.
Schadenfreude.
Schadenfreude. There we go.
Uh,
But it reminds me of like English speakers saying this is a phenomenon that exists, but we don't have a word for it that so encapsulates it as the German
oh yeah,
word.
there's lots. I mean, we someday,
Oh no.
probably not on stream.
Yeah.
You might have already guessed that with my belief in the power of language, the importance of language, I do think that there are things endemic to the structure of English and the development of it linguistically that are that created / allowed a certain populace to become a colonially dominant populace. There's things about the language itself and the way that it's structured that result in both adopting terms that we find useful, but also shaping people in the ways that when they see something useful, they take it.
Interesting.
But that's just my own fun little linguistic theories.
That would be great to talk about sometime.
Yeah, I don't. We'll just have to do a stream specifically about like it'd be like that podcast you sent me. It's like this is specifically for very inaccessible and specific language about philosophy and linguistics, and don't listen to this if you don't want to hear us use the term heuristics all the time. You know.
Yeah, and then I wonder why my brain did not register any of that and just loved it.
Because you speak that language.
I don't really speak the language though. I think it's that my brain lights up a lot when I hear new words. Like it's very.
Well, that's not like jargon. What we were just talking about, right? It's developed and used when somebody knows what it's used for to encapsulate a specific thing that we could encapsulate in other words. Like every word is definable by other words.
Yeah.
But using other existing words is more time and energy consuming than this brief version, like acronyms and stuff and whatever. But as a natural consequence of that, when someone uses the jargony term and someone else doesn't know what it is, it hits our attention as a novel thing. If other variables in the context are such that we have reason to believe that it would be valuable to know what that person is saying, well, now we want to know what that word means. Yeah. And so that means that using words that people don't know does have an impact of saying, I have stuff you don't have. And that's not always intentional. Sometimes it's a byproduct. And sometimes it's just, sometimes it is people's way of saying, see, I'm smarter than you, or I want you to feel less than me.
Yeah, sometimes I think I can usually, well, I guess I couldn't technically tell this, but when some people do it as sort of a dominating thing and other people are like, I just love, like that's more of your vibe, like, I just love language.
Well, the difference, I think, is do people make an attempt to make that language accessible? Meaning,
exactly.
If I am using a term that they're recommending an episode of the podcast Rough Translation, which sounds interesting. There was a term you used earlier, liminal, that I almost said, will you explain what that means to people?
Yeah, and I'm just obsessed with that word.
Yeah, well, to me, that's the difference. If I am using words that I have reason to believe the person that I'm talking to or people observing me speak might not know already.
Yeah, you're always welcome to slow me down because I didn't perceive that I was doing that.
Yeah, well, sometimes though, when you ask people to do that, it can come across as a challenge.
No, you're welcome to.
But that to me is the difference. Is if I'm using language that you don't know, either I'm aware that I'm using language that you don't know, or have a suspicion, in which case I should only be using it if I think it is useful to introduce that term to you, which means I will introduce the term then and there, like on my footnotes,
That's really funny.
Or if I have reason to believe and I am aware of the fact that you might not know and I don't introduce it, then I am likely just trying to have an impact on you of making you interested in what I'm saying.
Well, I think doing this live could be a really good way for me to become a better therapist because I think I do that all the time without realizing it.
You know what I think about good and bad, better and worse therapists.
I don't know what other words to use.
Be more specific.
Effective, more specific.
What I'm saying is being a good therapist is a general statement. What makes someone a good therapist for one client makes them a bad therapist for a different client.
More effective with the certain population of neurodivergent people I work with.
Sure, but even better than that, just like saying, what specific harmful thing someone did as opposed to saying they're a narcissist, would be to say, what is the specific thing you are hoping might happen, the specific language or experience or ability or whatever that you might encounter or develop, and why you might think it would be useful working with a population. I know when you got to go. Just that. And I also think it's worth noting that sometimes people use that language and they might just be unaware that the other people they're speaking to don't know that language.
Yeah.
But in that case, that indicates either they're not paying very close attention, close enough attention to determine that someone might not know that, especially in response. If you don't know a term, you're probably going to have some visual response or energetic response that a person paying attention to you will say, oh, like how many times have we all just been talking to somebody and we say something and then after be like, oh, that means that we get some cue.
Yeah.
Or that their specific language is lacking in whatever specific cues they might pick up on if they were paying attention to be able to determine that somebody else don't know it. In other words, especially in academia, but a lot of, the more like siloed people get and the more specialized they get, the more likely it is that they forget that other people don't talk and think the way that they do generally.
Yeah.
So anyway, relevant to autism a lot.
Super relevant to autism. Patterns. Yeah.
We do have to go then. This was fun. Was it?
Yes. I haven't been asked that question enough in my life to be, which is kind of a sad thing to say, but.
What a note to end on.
Yeah.
Not because it's super sad, but because
like
now I want to talk about it. Because people are going to watch this sometime, whether right now or when it's like VOD later, and they're going to be like, oh, that's language that applies to my experience. I've never thought about it in those terms
next
before.
week then.
Okay.
Maybe isn't that a thing people do? Like I wasn't doing that.
Tell Marie, I'll forget.
I'll forget too.
Well,
I'll scroll to the end and be like.
Honestly, Marie will probably watch this. She usually does when she can't be here.
That's so cool. She's great.
She is great. So yeah, Marie, have us talk about.
I very much enjoyed all of the comments. Cliffhanger. I can read that. I need to go back to my optometrist, I think. So. Okay. My eye doctor.
Another useful conclusion drawn from today's experience. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you, Baston Cider, and thank you, Dad, especially those of you who are communicating with us, and everybody else. Thank you too. It's not like you're less valuable because you're not communicating. I just don't know anything about you. Cliffhanger. All right, there you go. They're saying they can start typing in all caps. Will that help you? Can you read the caps one?
Yeah, I actually can. It's easier.
I mean, I don't think that you're yelling all the time, and I'll be very offended, but Caitlin will be able to read it now.
Help us something.
Help us make this VOD go viral. Virality.
Oh my gosh.
Such an interesting concept.
Are we COVID 2023?
Well, that's what I'm saying. It's generally discussed as a desirable thing.
What is it?
Please don't be offended, Brandon. I can't read it and not hear it as a yell. I know, I understand the context now, but it's still the automatic translation as a yell. Anyway.
That's so funny.
Oh, there's lots of fascinating stuff to talk about there. How all caps communicates a tone. Anyway. All right, good to be with you. Thank you all. Talk to you.
Super fun.
Probably next week. I am planning on being here next week. I'll let you all know if that's not going to happen.
I may be.
If not, definitely 2 weeks from now, but I'm planning on being here next week.
Yeah.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
What an abrupt end.